Welcome to the Art of Faith podcast. I'm Joshua Kapczynski, your host today, and it is March, the end of March 2024. And what I wanted to do today in our podcast is talk about basically some current events and how it impacts the church and, well, frankly, why I think that God might be doing something creative in this whole process. The current events that I want to address today are church scandal. And it's nothing new to church life. There's always been some scandal. There's always been some pastor or evangelist that has made poor choices and everybody else has to pay for them. It seems to be a bit of an epidemic these days. And this is something that I don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about on a Sunday morning from the pulpit, but it is something that's a little bit heavy on my heart. And so I just want to take this time just to share with you what's in my heart. So many of you are familiar, maybe with the 1980s and 90s mega church televangelist scandals like the Bakers and Jimmy Swaggart and just, sleeping around with the secretary and getting caught with hookers and that kind of thing. And these were men of God that I didn't necessarily look up to Jim Bakker. I didn't like him, but I did like Jimmy Swaggart, which was kind of an odd one because he was so old school and dated for me. But I loved Jimmy Swaggart's teachings. And so as a young man, when he got caught with the prostitute, like I was genuinely hurt and I was genuinely devastated, and found it hard to believe. And then when he confessed and the whole crying thing, and everybody made fun of him for repenting and all that, which was equally disturbing. That bothered me. Jim Bakker, that one didn't affect me hardly at all because I didn't like him, and yeah, just. It was kind of like, well, really not that surprised on that one. Like that one didn't shock me. So since then, we've had a few, but that haven't been that big of a deal. But lately, major leaders within the evangelical church or evangelical American Christianity, like a lot of really tough things have been happening. There's been lots of exposure. There's been lots of scandal. And so I want to run through a few of them, maybe some of them that you don't even know about. But let's see, before COVID happened, there was the McDonald's scandal where he was doing inappropriate stuff and actually put a hit out on somebody, which is unheard of. Like no pastor has ever hired a hitman to take somebody out. But McDonald did that, and you might not know the name, but you can Google that one. But the big one that happened after McDonald, and there seemed like to be a wave of church scandals, was Bill Hybels, who is the founding pastor of Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. And he basically framed out the model of the seeker-sensitive church. And he was so successful in bringing in non-believers or people that had no church grid and inviting them into church and having the community to do so. And so his church was huge, tens to thousands, maybe 20,000 at one point. And so his reach was huge. His networking abilities was equally as big. And like I personally went to one of his conferences in Chicago, and I personally did his trainings, and I personally listened to his leadership material. His leadership material was so good. It was so beneficial, and it helped me as a young church leader. Everything that Bill Hybels put out, specifically in his, I guess back then it wasn't called a podcast, but he did this show called Defining Moments. And basically it was just like down and dirty church leadership skills that every church needs. And so that was a huge benefit. And so Hybels got in trouble for flirting with girls, crossing the line here and there inside a church. And then it turned out that it was actually a part of the church culture. So not only did he get in trouble for inappropriate behavior, but some of his staff did too. So it was something that was taking place not just from the top, but through other middle parts of the leadership of the church. And I guess it was just a common thing. And it just kind of turned out that everybody was working so hard that everybody was also having affairs. And this is a little bit of a hyperbole, but it is a part of the church culture. It was so devastating and disappointing that somebody that was not a charismatic, by the way, I think Heibel's background is reformed, uh, was so disappointing and ended his ministry definitely on a negative note. I'm not quite sure what Willow Creek is up to these days. They're probably just trying to limp along and trying to forget about the past, which is, I mean, it's just sad. The next one, which was shocking and devastating, was the scandal with Ravi Zacharias. Now, Ravi Zacharias didn't pastor a church, uh, but he was the poster boy for apologetic ministry, meaning that he gave um, great support for the gospel. He could prove it. You know, he had this way to communicate to intellectuals that didn't believe in God. So if anybody needed to have a debate against an atheist, like Ravi Zachariah was the guy that you'd want to hire. And specifically, something that addresses our culture now with the pluralism is that, you know, this was a man that came out of Hinduism and fell in love with Jesus, and then he could have an honest conversation about, do all faiths lead to heaven? And it was like he was the man for defending Christianity in our modern time. They were calling him the new C.S. Lewis. And unfortunately, after he died, it turns out that um, he had affairs with women on the road, and it was just a tragic thing, disappointing thing. And so we lost a lot of reputation inside of the Christian world because of that moral failure. And now the one that bothers me right now, the most recent, is the recent scandal with Pastor Mike Bickle from International House of Prayer, Kansas City. Um, so the other ones that I mentioned earlier, with the exception of Swaggart, they were non-charismatics. And if you follow me, you know that I'm a charismatic pastor, meaning I believe that all the gifts are for today. I believe that God still speaks to us. He speaks to us through his word, through the Bible, but the Lord also speaks to us in other ways, creative ways. And I think probably most people would agree with it, but in a charismatic expression, some people feel uncomfortable with how that gets expressed. So Mike Bickle was an early vineyard leader and eventually broke off from the vineyard movement. And I was a vineyard pastor back in the day. And so, he's part of my tribe. I was never a Mike Bickle fanboy. In fact, our church did not embrace the whole Kansas City prophet phenomena that happened in the 90s. We thought it was excessive. We thought it was weird. We thought it was out of character and going into extremes. And the personal issues that we had with the Kansas City prophet movement is that we had personal history with the leaders inside of that movement. Paul Cain was one of the prophets, and Paul Cain was an older gentleman that came out of the holiness movement that the Vineyard and Kansas City prophet movement adopted, and he just kind of became, one of the resident prophets that everybody looked up to and thought was awesome. And I can't deny that some very interesting things happened inside of the context of Paul Cain's ministry. But the problem with Paul Cain is that, he had moral problems of him, moral issues. And one of the reasons why I know this is that my grandfather was good friends with Paul Cain. and he did ministry in our church, and it got him to the point where we had to ask him not to do ministry in our church because of his character. And the same happened. Well, we never had Bob Jones minister to our church, but we definitely had red flags about um, the prophet Bob Jones's processes. It was too extreme. It was not. Didn't seem like there was any fruit. Didn't seem like there was any health. And this is what Mike Bickle was a part of. And the irony is that Mike Bickle was responsible for the church discipline and the restoration of Bob Jones, because Bob Jones had a thing for the ladies too. So recently, Mike Bickle, the beginning of or the end of last year, was there are accusations brought against him that he was grooming and manipulating young women, 14-year-olds, and that there was a string of them, and some of the language that they would say was being repeated, and it looks like it's definitely something that definitely happened. And there was independent investigators that were brought in. The the Roy's report did an in-depth analysis of what was going on. Dr. Michael Brown tried to step in and help out, but also was like, "Yeah, this has happened, and we need to be as biblical about this as we possibly can be." So the whole thing went south and sideways. Now, again, I just kind of gave a history of all this really bad behavior, and so why does this one bother me? I would say that the Mike Bickle one bothers me just as much as the Jimmy Swaggart one does. And again, I wasn't a Mike Bickle fanboy. I read his book. It wasn't that great. So this is what bothers me about it, is that his reach was so huge, and he built a ministry that was focused around prayer and intercession and intimacy with God, which is something that we all want. And probably what I'm struggling with is that, was maybe if you have an idea about this, put it in the comments, because I'm still trying to work through it. Did God bless Mike Bickle's ministry? I mean, it's for some of you that have done time in the Kansas City prayer room, you would probably say yes, that you probably would say, you felt the presence of God. And I think probably what I'm struggling with is that why would God bless a groomer? Because some of these accusations go back 20 years and it seems like they're legitimate accusations. So why would God bless a groomer? And I don't really have an answer for that. And I think, honestly, my heart goes towards the victims that were manipulated, that were emotionally controlled, that were spiritually abused. I can't speak to their experience, but I mean, I would hope that they have some type of reconciliation with the church in general, and that God meets them where they're at and loves them. I mean, my heart really is for the people that have been manipulated and spiritually coerced in these situations. So this is like, I'm just trying to deal with that. So, yeah, let me know what you think about this one, because again, I'm working through it as a pastor. I'm like, God, why did it seem like this ministry was blessed? God, was your hand, was your spirit upon this ministry, or was it just all a scam? Was it all a sham? I know that, when Mike Bickle was bringing in these extreme prophets and things were getting very weird for the Vineyard movement, our church made a public statement about it. Said this is too much, and it's gonna backfire. Our church, this is actually on record, our church made a statement that Mike Bickle was probably a dangerous person. Back in the 90s, no one paid attention to that. No one thought that that was fair, that we were being, that we were out of line because House of Prayer was the next greatest thing. It was the new fad on the block. Everybody loved it. Everybody thought it was great. It's popular and it's what the people wanted. But there was no character there. There was no fruit. And then when somebody tries to call out the excesses of a spiritual movement, you kind of get shut down and ridiculed for it. But the sad part is it just turned out to be true. Um, like when we were putting the brakes on, like this man was already grooming women and abusing them. It's like this is disgusting. So now, with all this negative stuff that seems to be taking place in the context of the American evangelical church, I don't even technically consider myself an evangelical, by the way, but all of this stuff that's taking place, like where do we see in our current culture? Where do we see faith being expressed and encouraged in a strong way? So here's the irony of this whole situation that I see that I'm fascinated by, because even though my heart is breaking for mistakes that's happening inside the church, and my wife and I have conversations about this all the time. We're always having faith conversations, and we're like, okay, it really seems like God's cleaning out his church. Like he's going to purify it. He's bringing us into a place of purity, and like there's a reckoning that's going on. And I think that's a good thing. I'm all on board. Let's make sure that church is a safe place for everyone, and that there's nothing inside of us, inside of me, that would ever want to hurt or manipulate anyone. So that's our heart. So in one sense, like all of the stuff that's getting exposed, it needs to be exposed. It needs to come out into the open. And if it gets splattered all over social media, like frankly, the church deserves it, because it's been just doing horrible things. Now, to where it seems as like there's a lack of faith inside of the church, where we do see faith being expressed, because God is always on the move, and God's a creative God. And so, this is the Art of Faith podcast. And so I believe that God's expressing faith in different ways, in essence, outside of traditional church. So who is talking about faith these days, who's talking about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, is Jordan Peterson. Like that guy is talking more about Jesus, and he's given expository, in-depth psychological looks into the scripture, and people are looking at it more than they're looking at my stuff or any other pastor or theologians. Like his reach is huge. And if you watch his stuff, like he is wrestling with God. In fact, his whole new series right now and his whole new tour is called Those That Wrestle with God. And so he's having faith conversations with a huge majority of the population that don't set foot in church. That's exciting. Like, and that's powerful. And that is an artistic way of expressing faith that, in my opinion, is really encouraging. One of the conversations that my staff and I had, like, if Jesus was alive today, who would he pick to be his disciples? And so one might be Jordan Peterson. I don't think that he would pick certain, mega church pastors. I think he's going to pick other people. The other one that I think that he would definitely pick would be Russell Brand. Now, if you don't know who Russell Brand is, give him a Google. And like the guy's strange, and he is extremely eccentric, and he's a charismatic leader. And I use that word charismatic in that he has a charisma about him that has absolutely nothing to do with God, but he's playing around with spirituality. He's playing around with God. He's even now calling himself a follower of Jesus. And he's saying this on his platform that has a reach of millions. And this is somebody that no evangelist has witness to, that he didn't go to church and do an altar call. He's just a curious, open person. and he's trying to be honest with himself and honest with his life, and this process has actually led him to Jesus. And so, like, his witness right now is huge. I mean, I'm praying that it sticks. I really do believe that it will, and I think that if Jesus was picking disciples, he'd probably pick this guy. And you know, if you've read the Gospels, you know that the disciples weren't all perfect. You had a zealot, you had a grumpy fisherman. You've got some people that are morally compromised. You have greedy people. You had the whole spectrum inside of the 12 disciples. And so I think you probably would have picked this one. So it's just fascinating that more people are hearing about the love of God through somebody like Russell Brand than they are about from a majority of Christian pastors these days. Fascinating. The other one that is really interesting that's flirting around with not only God but even the divinity of Jesus is Joe Rogan. And like, he's got the most popular podcast in the world. His reach is absolutely huge. On his podcast, he has never had a faith leader on his podcast, but he has other people that bring up the topic of spirituality, and inevitably he ends up talking about God. He had not Chris Rock, the white guy, Kid Rock. He had Kid Rock on his show, and then they start talking about Jesus. And Kid Rock, of all people, is a Christian, probably not the best one in the world, but he believes in Jesus. And Joe Rogan asked him on one of his podcasts, like, if you could go back in time, if you had a time machine, where would you go? And Kid Rock says, I'd go see Jesus. And Joe has a very interesting response. He says, well, what if he wasn't there? And Kid Rock says, no, he's going to be there. And Joe says, like, so how do you know that Jesus would be there? How do you know it's not all fake? And Kid Rock's like, I just know. And Rogan says, how do you know? He's like, because I have faith. And Rogan says something very interesting. He says, you know what? That's a good answer. And so he's playing around with the idea. We know that he's definitely entertained the idea that there is a God, that there's a creator. The historical Jesus, he's kicking that around. Like, there's been a lot of guests that have framed it out. Like, yeah, there's a historical Jesus. We've got really good proof that, outside of scripture, that we have a historical Jesus. So he's playing around with this idea. And it seems like he's like, I just wouldn't be surprised if he makes that confession of faith. And so this is exciting times for us. It's how God chooses to reach people is not necessarily up to us. Like, he can do it in creative ways. There's an art to God's faith. And like, if he wants to use these people that we wouldn't think would be qualified to share the love of God to the world, I mean, he's just going to do it. And again, that doesn't seem like the cultural Christianity that we've developed is doing a tremendous job at the moment. It's been more embarrassing than anything else. So that's on my heart. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. So if you're like me and you're seeing all these scandals inside of church context, don't be discouraged. I want to encourage you to see it as a good thing, that maybe God is doing a new thing, and that he's got to purify the church. He's got to get all of this compromise, sinful nature outside of church leadership. He wants us to walk in purity, honesty, transparency. Like, I do think that God's going to do a great thing inside of the church. And when I say church, not just the American church, but the church worldwide. I'm encouraged, actually, that all of these things are coming into the light. And I'm equally and more encouraged that the love of God is being preached by some very unusual suspects in these days. I think that it could be leading up to, quite honestly, the end of days. So, like, we could be getting close. It's just so many interesting, strange things that are taking place. So, if I could encourage you with one thing, let's not be so myopic in how we view our faith. Obviously, I believe that church and being a part of a faith community is extremely vital. It's vital to your walk. It's vital to your relationship to God. But the faith communities that we find ourselves attached to, or specifically the leaders that we attach ourselves to, um, let's just say hypothetically, you've put your faith into a leader like Jim Baker or somebody that's had an epic fall, and then that has affected your faith. Like that's just not like God's bigger than flawed leaders. So he's got a creative way, not only to reach new people, but to encourage you. So don't go down these dark paths that I've gone down whenever I see people fall, when I see leaders fall and mess things up for everyone else. He's got a way, he's got a creative way to continue the good news and the salvation message of Jesus Christ. And if he can't use church leaders to do it, he's going to find other leaders to do it that will do a good job. All right. So with that, let's wrap it up. And I will see you next time on The Art of Faith, a production of Granite Creek Studios. We got a couple of other shows going on. One, you've got to see this movie, which is doing great right now. And we'll got some more productions coming up down the road. God bless you guys, and see you next time. Peace.